Before I get into the details of the IDE, I'd like to answer the question, what is WebMatrix? WebMatrix is a community-based ASP.NET development environment from Microsoft. It's much more than just a simplified IDE. Besides the obvious of building ASP.NET applications, you can also build mobile device pages, user controls, class files, web services, HTTP handlers, all the way to simple HTML files, XML documents, and schemas, and you can even do some SQL editing. You can, in fact, create entire databases just using the ASP.NET WebMatrix IDE. That's actually something we'll cover in a later video. So the obvious question is, if WebMatrix is just another IDE from Microsoft, why should I use it over Visual Studio.NET? I think the easiest way to talk about the reasons why you'd use WebMatrix over Visual Studio is to talk about the differences between the two, so I'll just start there. I think the thing that struck me first was the fact that WebMatrix isn't project-based like Visual Studio is. In other words, you really just edit a bunch of files, and the only reason they're related is because you put them in the same directory. That's not to say that you can't obviously create an entire application by yourself. It's just not project-based, and it's not designed to be used like Visual Studio in the sense that you can tightly integrate it with Visual Source Safe and easily share source and swap parts of projects between development teams. I think the other obvious difference between the two is that WebMatrix is very small compared to Visual Studio. I think the installation size is really only around 1 meg, and Visual Studio is obviously much larger than that. So I guess that lightweightness comes at a price. There's some really whiz-bang features in Visual Studio that WebMatrix just doesn't support. For instance, the IntelliSense, which is huge for most of us, because I don't know about you, but I can't remember every single class and every single namespace in .NET just yet. Having said that, that doesn't render WebMatrix useless by any stretch. I think another big difference is that WebMatrix won't automatically compile class files into assemblies for you. You have to do that at the command line, or you could build a utility and create an add-in for it, and then use it from within WebMatrix. Another big difference is the actual page structure of the ASP.NET pages that WebMatrix allows you to create. By default, it creates pages with the inline method where you would create a script block and then put your actual C# or VB.NET code in the same file. So instead of having the code behind, everything is in the same file, a little bit closer to the traditional ASP model. Another big difference is that the WebMatrix, I keep referring to it as the WebMatrix project, and that's because it was designed to be a community tool. It's integrated with links back to the ASP.NET community, and it was actually developed by feedback from some key players in the ASP.NET community. But I guess the most important difference between the two is the cost. WebMatrix is free, and you can download it. We have a link to it in the resources section on the website. So I strongly encourage you to download it and follow along throughout the rest of the video, because I'm just about through beating you to death with the slides. I haven't directly addressed the question, why use WebMatrix over Visual Studio.NET. In general, I'd say I'd use it for lightweight projects when I only wanted to simply, edit one page, or maybe smaller projects that only had a handful of pages in the entire application. Certainly, if I was going to work on a project that was just a one-man project where I didn't have to collaborate with other developers. If I couldn't afford Visual Studio or MSDN for that matter, then I would definitely use WebMatrix. It's a great learning tool, so I would expect that many universities and then just other people who are wanting to learn .NET would pick it up because it is free and it's very powerful. I'm not going to walk through the installation of the ASP.NET WebMatrix application itself, because the installation is just very straightforward. If you follow the defaults, you'll have no problems at all. Instead, I'm just going to dive right into the introduction of the IDE. I want to go ahead and start with the menus and toolbar options, and then I'll move on to some of the other features like the toolbox and the workspace and all this other stuff. If you've used Visual Studio, it probably looks somewhat familiar to you. Most of the menus have the basic items on them that you'd expect. You can create a new file. I'll go through the different file types in a moment, or open an existing file. You've got a recent file history list, basic edit, view, format, layout, HTML, workspace, tools, window. I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. Let me go ahead and start with the file menu, and we'll just create a new file. And the first thing you'll get is the Add New File dialog box. I'm just going to create a simple ASP.NET page so that we can move on and look at the rest of the features that will be activated once I've actually got a file there. And then I'll come back later and we can cover very briefly each of these other class types, because some of the more interesting things are down here in the Data Pages section. It actually comes with a bunch of templates for several different types of ASP.NET pages. So I'll just create a new ASP.NET page. And let me just put this on my desktop. It won't let me. I'm going to change my default language to C# because that's what I prefer. And we'll just call this first page. File menu is pretty basic. Besides creating a new file like I just did, or opening an existing file, obviously you can save and save as, you can close the existing file, print preview, change your print settings, and as I said before, there's a recent files list, so I could come back later and open up this file again simply by coming down to the recent files rather than having to remember where I put it and browse to it. Now the edit menu has some interesting features here that we'll get into once I start editing a page, but there's the basic undo and redo, cut, copy, paste, select all. You'll notice this add snippet, which is grayed out. When I cover the toolbox, there's actually, you'll see this my snippet section. So you could have a piece of code here and then go edit, add snippet, and like I said, I'll cover that in a minute. The view is actually pretty interesting because you can select the default, which is the design view here, where you can drag controls over. You could select the HTML view and get to see the source of it. Move these windows out of the way. You could select the code view, which there isn't any code, but if I wanted to create, let's just say, public void foo method, we'll save that. And go back to the HTML and you don't see it, or on the design view. And then you'll notice the all, and you basically just see the whole page this way. So this is exactly how you would create a page if you were going to use Notepad or something. You'll notice a start button. So let me add a little bit more to the page here, and then I'll go ahead and do that. But basically that just either cranks up the built-in web server that comes with WebMatrix, or it'll ask you to create a virtual directory under IIS if you have IIS installed. And you also have the View Toolbox, which you can turn on and off. And we'll cover the toolbox in a minute. And then if you're on the design, let me go back to View Design. You can view your glyphs, as they call them, which are just graphical representations of some of the HTML tags and some of the controls. You can view borders, grid, and snap to grid. So, going back to the view in the start command, let me add a little bit more functionality here. I'll use the all. One more thing that I wanted to point out here before we move on to that. I could either do all that via this view menu item, or I can come down here towards the bottom of the page. You'll notice these tabs. It does exactly the same thing. I like the all view for now. Okay, now let me edit this so that it actually does something. Okay, let me edit this so that it actually does something. I'll just create a page load method. Move this over so you can see. And I'll just write something into the label 1 text property. How about the ubiquitous hello world, or variation thereof? Okay. Now I'm going to need to save this to a location other than my desktop because of the default security settings for both IIS and the WebMatrix web server. So I'll just save this really anywhere on my computer. And I'll just put it here. Now when I go back to the view and start, I'll get this dialog. So I can either use the built-in WebMatrix server, and you notice that it doesn't run on the default 80. That's because I've got, or port 80, it's because I've got IIS installed. I could just as easily do the user create an IIS virtual directory, but I'll go ahead and use the WebMatrix just since that's why we're here. Click on Start, and let me move the window down here so you can see. You'll notice what popped up in my taskbar. It's just a little icon reminding me that the web service has started up. We'll go back up here to the top of the page, and you'll see the output of the file, just as you'd expect. So let's move on and look at some of the other options that are available in the view window. Let me go back to the design mode so we can talk about some of these other items. We can turn the glyphs on. You'll notice you get these little icons. I can stick a hyperlink in here, text box, checkbox, whatever. Let's go down. You can look at the HTML and see what it did. See that it put it outside of the form tags. If we actually try to run this, .NET would probably laugh at us. So I'm going to move these back up here, and then go back to the design view, and you'll see all those controls are now inside of these little form glyphs, as they call it. I can turn on borders, grid. That way you could actually line things up. Snap to grid. You get the picture. It's really the same design surface as Visual Studio, so if you know how to operate within that environment, you can figure out how to operate in this one. For that matter, it's a lot like many of the other WYSIWYG editors out there. You have a format menu, so it's just for formatting text or HTML. You just type something in. And then I could highlight a word, go to the format menu, make it bold, just like any other editor really. Italic. You can change colors, you can change alignment, make bulleted lists, unordered list for that matter. And go down here, we can look at the source, see what it did. Just stuck in some UL and LI tags for us. You can format an entire block via predefined formats, very similar to Word. You could indent or unindent. So just pretty basic formatting stuff. Another menu item is probably somewhat less familiar is the layout menu. If you select a control and then click on Layout Absolute Position, WebMatrix adds an absolute position CSS style tag to the element. So we come down to the HTML tab and look at that text box control. You'll see that it's positioned absolutely with a pixel top and left coordinate. You could do that for all these, but you'll notice we select one that hasn't been. Well, I guess I already changed that back to non-absolute and look at HTML. We can look at the hyperlink control. Or the checkbox control. It's not absolute positioned. One of the other less familiar menu items is the HTML menu. Let me just remove some of these controls. Move on to the HTML. I'm going to leave that one in there so our code doesn't break. Create some room in here. The HTML menu has an insert hyperlink and an insert table. And they pretty much do exactly what you expect. Insert hyperlink just pops up a little dialog box. You can say my link, or how about insert a URL. Then you'll notice you have a hyperlink there. We can look at the HTML, and it just creates a simple anchor tag, just as you'd expect. The other item here would be the insert table, and it just, again, pops up a simple dialog box. You can specify a number of rows and columns, and you can have an absolute width and height for the table as well. Let's say 1 row, 2 columns. And look at the HTML it's created. Just as you'd expect. Insert this down into one of these cells. And remove all these paragraph tags. Go back to the design view. Let me save this. Another interesting item on the HTML menu is the wrap and span and wrap and div. You'll notice they're grayed out because they're disabled, but if I added another control or even just some text here, I could highlight everything I wanted and go to HTML wrap and span, and you'll go back to the HTML view. You'll notice it inserted span tags for us. I could treat this just like any other span, or div for that matter, if I inserted div. The workspace menu item manipulates the workspace window over here. There's a couple of options. Basically, you can select the Add Folder shortcut. Pops up this little dialog, so you could browse to some directory where maybe you had some code, a little code snippet that you know of that you want to include in your project. You could just select it and say OK, and then it shows up here in your workspace window, and then you have easy access to it, so you could open up, you know, a file from another project or whatever. If you decide that you don't want that in your way anymore, you just select it, and then you can either right-click and delete it, or you can just click this delete button on top of the workspace window. The other interesting item in the workspace menu is the Add FTP connection. If you had access to the internet at the time that you created this, you could simply type in the FTP site, whatever port FTP is running on. The default is 21, the username and password, and then it would connect and authenticate you using your username and password unless you did anonymous. Then you'd have access to the files on that FTP server as if they were on your machine. I don't actually have an internet connection right now, so I'll just cancel out of that. The last thing in the workspace is the Add New Item. And this brings up the same dialog as if you had clicked on File New. You could select the actual directory that you're in and do the same thing. And you'll notice you get this browse menu. The next menu is the Tools menu. And just as its name implies, it's just a list of the different tools that are available to you. The first and probably the most useful is the web, well, in my opinion, the web service proxy generator. We'll cover this in more details when we cover web services in general, but basically you could just select the URL of the WSDL that you want to base this proxy on. Give it namespace, default language, and then you can select a directory for its output as well as the actual source. The next one is the Run Add-in menu item. This would be a list of the add-ins that you have sort of registered with the IDE. Remember earlier in the video I talked about the need for maybe some kind of a class compilation add-in. This would be one place for you to, this would show up if you created one and added it. The next item, Organized Add-ins, is where you'd actually add it. So you'll notice that the Web Service Proxy Generator is actually just an add-in that the WebMatrix team created for us. So I could add one online. Just trying to find that URL. Or I could add a local one if I created my own add-in. I just have to go select the assembly and then add, and then it would show up here. If I wanted to remove one, I could either check it or click the remove. The next options are all about manipulating the toolbox that I mentioned earlier. So if I created my own custom web control, which is different than a user control, I could add it here. So I could either do one online or local, and you basically get the same dialog that you would for an add-in. You just have to select the assembly that it's in, and then click on Add, shows up here, and then that will show up over here in your custom controls. We'll create custom controls in a later video, and I'll show you how to add those to the custom controls toolbox at that time. So the final option on the Tools menu is the Preferences dialog. You just have some general, at startup, you'll notice that Create New File dialog starts every time you open it. I actually don't like that. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off just so that it'll show an empty environment, because I know that all I have to do is select File New and I'll get that dialog back. You can select as many items in your recent file menu as you want, up to 10. And there's just some simple text editing options. You basically can just control the font face and the font size. It'll give you a whole lot of options, but I like a fixed width like Courier New. And then web editing. This dialog just explains that if you edit your HTML or ASPX pages in the design mode, it's going to automatically format it to XHTML. So basically it's going to change your code. So it's telling you if you don't like that, then you need to switch over to the HTML or the all view for all of your HTML editing. You can change the default view so that when you click on a file, it'll open up in one of those. I'll go ahead and select source because that is my preference, and it's easy enough to go down to either the the View menu or the tab at the bottom of the page if you wanted to change that. The Window menu is just a basic MIDI window menu item. You can cascade multiple files, tile them, or close them all. It also gives you a list down here of all the files that are open. Then you have the Help menu. You can pop up General Help, which is all web-based, as you'll see here. And there's actually a local copy of this stuff, which is nice. There's also some online documentation. You can go to the .NET documentation or different things on the ASP.NET community site. Other than that, it's just a basic help with an About Web Matrix dialog. This will just show you the build and the version. So that's pretty much all there is to the menu item, and we can start on the toolbar items. Basically, the toolbar items mimic everything that the menu items do. It's just a little bit easier way to grab them, so I'm not going to go through all these in detail like I did all the menu items. I'll just highlight the interesting ones, like the Edit Tag button here. Basically, wherever your cursor is on the design surface, it'll pop up a little edit window. So you could just edit that little piece of HTML if you wanted to. I'm not sure if I find that terribly useful, but maybe on a complicated page it would be useful just to isolate something out. Now I'd like to talk about the different file types that are available to you to edit in the Web Matrix application. If you click on this New File, you'll get this dialog. You can see all the different options. You have simple ASP.NET pages. You can create a new user controller, ASCX, HTML, style sheets, classes, XML. You can create XML documents or schemas. Create SQL scripts. You can create HTTP handlers. You'll also notice over here in the templates section of the window, there's data pages. And if you click on that, you'll get a bunch of different options for templates. All these templates are designed to run against the PUBS database if you have PUBS installed. So if you'd like to see these examples, I'd install either the MSDE or SQL Server and get an installation of PUBS. We'll go ahead and open one of these up because they're pretty nice representation of some of the things that you can do with the Web Matrix application. I'll just call this paging, ASPX, do it in C#. And I'm going to go ahead and hide the toolbox just so we have a little bit more room to look at the code and scoot this window out of the way. You'll notice it just assumes a local connection to the PUBS database. And it's just a very simple example of how to data bind using ASPX, or using an ASPX page and using ASP.NET Web Matrix. And go to the design view, and you'll see you get the data grid. We move this up here so you can see properties window. We could come in here and auto format this the same as you would with Visual Studio. Let's just select that, and you'll notice that it changed it. So I'm not going to belabor that point too much because in future videos I'm going to walk through each one of these templates. Let me go back to the Add New File dialog. It also gives you templates for caching. You can obviously vary your cache by browser header parameters or none, as this case is. You can open up one of these just to show you the kind of code that it sticks in there for you. You'll see the vary by param up here. If you pass in the parameter category, it's going to cache that off for you. So pretty helpful example if you've never dealt with caching before. There's some security templates as well. This just shows you how to do some basic forms-based authentication. It includes the changes you need to make to the config file. And then there's some simple web service templates as well. So, as I've said, I'm going to walk through probably each one of these, or at least each one of these types in individual videos. I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of the kinds of things that WebMatrix comes standard with. Some pretty handy things. Next thing I want to do is talk about the toolbox and all the different windows that you have at your disposal there. I've gone ahead and cleared off all the bogus controls and examples that I did through the first part of the video. I just want to start with the HTML elements. Basically, you can just drag and drop anything you want onto the form, onto the design surface here. You'll notice that it inserted form tags just as you'd expect. While you're in the HTML mode, you continue to have these items at your disposal, as well as the web controls. One thing you will notice is that the My Snippets and Custom Controls is empty. Let's go back to the design view here. You have all basic HTML elements here, from the label, the text box. You notice this doesn't show up in the design view. Come back to the HTML view and you'll see from here you could edit these however you wanted. Go back to the design view and talk about the web controls. Add a label. Text box, whatever. This should probably look very familiar to you if you're used to Visual Studio. You even have access to all their built-in controls, server controls, the custom validators, data list, data grid. They create a matrix data grid. I'll talk about the differences between those two in a future video. You have access to the calendar control. Let me remove some of these other controls. That was the HTML stuff. Let me try to scroll this into view for you. Basically, you could edit this tag this way. I'm having a hard time getting these things to show up, so I'm going to have to move my recorder window down here. You'll notice that you'll get the same auto format link that you would in Visual Studio. It gets the same control, so you'd expect that. So clicking on that, you can just select some default styles. And it changes it just as it would in Visual Studio. You can go edit the tag, and you can see all the stuff that it inserted for you. Let me just remove that control. And I'm going to resize the IDE. Let me go ahead and exclude this workspace and properties windows for now. We already talked about the workspace window briefly. We'll come down to the properties and the class view in a minute, but for now I just want to get it out of the way so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm not going to dive into every one of these web controls right now. In future videos, I'm going to approach this much like we have the Visual Studio.NET videos. That is to say that where appropriate, we'll have entire videos or sections of videos that cover using these different items like the data grid and the data list repeaters, the different validation controls. It's essentially going to be the same approach, but there'll be a few minor differences. So if if you find yourself not using Visual Studio because you don't have access to it, or if you just rather use WebMatrix, then it'd be appropriate to go back and watch those videos if you've already seen the ones that were done from the Visual Studio perspective. So we come down to the custom controls. Like I said, I don't have any custom controls installed on this machine at the time, but if I wanted to add one, I could just simply right-click, as it says in this dialog box. I could sort them. I could add a local one, or I could browse the one online. And if I had any that were registered in the GAC, they'd show up here, or I could browse to one if I happen to know where one was. But like I said, I know I don't have any custom controls on this machine, so I won't be able to show you installing one of those. Now, one of the more interesting tabs in the toolbox is this My Snippets tab. If you'll switch over to the code view, let's see, there is no code here because I cleared it all out, but the makers of WebMatrix have taken the liberty of inserting a few of these for you. You can just double-click on one of these items, and it pops up a simple little dialog for you. I'll just take these defaults for you. We can look at the HTML that it produced for us. So I probably need to just create a simple little method here. And we can look at the code that it created for us. This is actually another area that we've gotten some requests to cover in more detail, so I'll probably come back later and do a better video on actually sending email. But you'll see it uses all the classes and namespaces that you need to, and because it's using fully qualified namespaces with classes, you won't need to use the imports keyword. So basically, this creates a new mail message class, or instance rather, and then fills in a few properties, the from, the to, subject, and body. You specify the SMTP server. If you don't, it just assumes localhost. But you could just as easily select, anyone that you had on your network, and then you use the send method. So let me create another method here. We'll just call it select foo, and we'll double click on the select data method. It wants to connect to my local installation of SQL Server, which should be fine. Just pick a database here. Just go down to the pubs database, or I could easily create a new database. Click OK, and then I get the construct a select query dialog. This is pretty handy. There's other ways to get this dialog, and I'll cover those probably in another video. I just want to quickly go through this one. I won't belabor the point very much by going through these other insert, delete, and update code snippets, because they're going to operate exactly the same. They're going to pop up this dialog, you're going to select some fields, and then it's going to generate some code for you. I just wanted to show you what was possible. So I can select the authors table, and I'll just want the author ID, first name and last name, where something is equal to an author ID. So I want to pass the author ID in, is basically what I'm saying. You can add AND clauses or an OR clause. And here's the preview of the select statement it's going to insert. Now, one thing to note is that this is just going to insert some inline SQL. It's not as whiz-bang as the Visual Studio IDE. That is to say that it's not going to create a stored procedure for you. It doesn't have any of that capability. But you could construct a pretty complicated SQL query and then do the creation of the stored procedure on your own. Click Next, and it gives you an opportunity to test the query. I don't happen to have any of their author IDs memorized, so I won't be able to do that. Let me just look one up real quick. Okay. Let me just copy this over here. And we'll see it selects the one row in the pubs table that corresponds to Johnson White. Now we can click next. And you get your option of getting returned a data set or a data reader, which is pretty interesting. And you can name your method. So I incorrectly started a method. It's going to create a new one for me anyway. So let me just change this to get author. And I'll take, since it's just one simple thing, I'll just take a data reader. That's easier to spit out. Here's all the code that it created for me. Now, probably in a production environment, I'm going to want to change some of this default behavior. For instance, like I said before, the query string, I'd probably turn that into a stored procedure if at all possible. The connection string, I'd put that in a web.config file. So, see, it's pretty easy to use these code snippets, and those are just the default ones that are built in, but let's just say that I had my own method down here. We'll just call it get something. I guess if it's going to get something, I better make it return a type, huh? And then I could just highlight this text. Actually, I need to put this in the My Snippets section, but I could highlight any method or any code that I wanted and just drag it over to the My Snippets section. Let me go ahead and delete this. You'll see that if I wanted to add that snippet, I could just double click on it and add it back in here. So, maybe you find that you have a particular template or a way of starting methods off, or even classes off for that matter, and you do it over and over, but it's not really appropriate for inheritance. You could just create that text, drag it over to the My Snippets section, and then boom, you'd have it at your disposal every time. The last thing that I need to talk about before I talk about the different file types are these windows over here on the right-hand side of the IDE. I briefly talked about the workspace menu when I was talking about, or rather the workspace window when I was talking about the workspace menu. But I'm going to kind of go in reverse order because I want to end up there so that we can talk about the add new item option last. Let's go down here to the properties window first. I think in an effort to conserve space, I'm going to go ahead and hide some of these other windows. So give me just a second. I've hidden the toolbox window by going View and deselecting the toolbox. And this version doesn't allow you to hide these windows quite as easily as Visual Studio does. In Visual Studio, you can right-click up here and select Auto Hide and Dock and some of these other things. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that they're going to add that functionality to WebMatrix because I think it's pretty useful. Let me just slide this up because I want to talk about the property box first. I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way after I talk about these tabs. You notice down at the bottom of the properties window is a set of 3 tabs. Classes, Community, which is just links to the different community websites. Classes is like a class browser. This is pretty handy because it kind of gives you sort of on-the-fly documentation. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to know about the Microsoft C# namespace. You could just open up the namespace there, double-click on the class, and you get a little bit of information about that up here in the main window. You'll see that it just sort of outlines the hierarchy of the namespace. These are all hyperlinked to the documentation, or rather to the subsequent outline. So for instance, I could go up one level to Code DOM Provider and click on it, and I could just sort of see a quick little snapshot there. You'll notice over on the left-hand pane, you see the name of the class here, all the fields, properties, and methods. You just get a quick view of what's available there. You notice these two check boxes down here, Show Non-Public Members and Show Inherited Members. Click on there and we see here's everything that this Code DOM Provider class inherited from its parent class. You just deselect that and you can see the difference. Looks like it gets container and site in the properties, and then there's a bunch of methods that it inherits as well. Now clicking on the Show Non-Public Members, you see the constructors, and this is obviously a private constructor or probably protected, whatever. Yes, it was protected. And so you click on the actual member over here and you see a short, it's more like a declaration sentence than the definition itself. Now if you click on one of these two links, you'll see read MSDN documentation on the web, or I can read the local .NET Framework SDK documentation. So if I click on that, you'll see that it popped open a browser and it's got a local copy of the documentation here. And I could just browse this just like any other online documentation. One of the other handy features that's available from this view is this little search box. I just click in there and type the word control and then hit enter. And you'll see that it shows me all of the classes that have the word control in it. And that's quite a list. So I could drill down from here just as if I had gone down via the tree view, if you will. Or I could click back on this and browse all classes. Back to my search. This just sorts alphabetically by class type, visibility. This button lets me toggle between the assembly view and the namespace view. So you'll notice right now the default is via the namespace. If you happen to know the name of the namespace you're looking for, like let's say system.web.ui, I could go in here and probably drill down and find the control class. There it is. If I want to know maybe which assembly I need to include in order to gain access to a particular namespace or class, I could just toggle this over to the assembly view and I see all the names of the assemblies that I have local. If I had some of my own assemblies that I wanted to add to this control that weren't necessarily registered in the system, I could just click on Customize. Should probably look like a pretty familiar dialog to you. Click on the Browse. I could browse to the assembly or DLL and then add. That would add it down in this list here, and then once I click OK, that should show up in this view. So let me go back to the Properties window. That's actually where I started. Let me close this page here. Okay, I'm going to go back to the Design view, and I need to go to View, Toolbox, and Web Control. Let's just drop over Calendar Control here. And you'll notice over here in the Property window, let me move this out of the way. Since we know these tabs are, I'm going to go ahead and drag those out of view of the screen capture there. So the first thing you'll notice, like I showed you earlier, is this auto format. It's exactly the same control that you use in Visual Studio. So I could just select one. That changes it. And here you have access to all the individual properties that are available to that control. And you know, each control is different, and it's up to the designer of the control to implement support for this property designer. I could specify a cascading style sheet class name here. I could specify each individual style here, or just select different properties manually. And this operates just like the property window on Visual Basic IDE or the old, or rather the Visual Studio.NET IDE. So that's kind of the whirlwind tour of the ASP.NET Web Matrix application. In subsequent videos, I'll be going through most of the other functionality that I skimmed over in a little bit more detail, sometimes in a lot of detail. So thanks for watching.